Hello everybody, it's your friendly digital technology librarian, Christy here. We've reached another Friday, so of course I have another Film Rec Friday ready for everybody out there. Now, this week we are continuing on with our celebration of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month with a selection of films dedicated to celebrating the lives of three incredible female fine artists whose lives and personalities are just as vibrant and fascinating as their work. These women are incredible. They are intelligent. They are at the forefront of their fields. And I think that you are going to find these three documentaries to be absolutely entertaining in addition to informative. As always, these recommendations are available to you entirely for free with the use of your Milan-Berlin library card, and they can be found on one of our video services, which are CleveNet's Overdrive, Hoopla Digital, and Canopy. So without any further ado, let's move to the recs. Okay, my first recommendation is available on both Hoopla and on Canopy, and that is for 2020's The Barefoot Artist. Now, Barefoot Artist is one of those documentaries I didn't even know existed prior to putting together this list. I'd heard of and was vaguely familiar with the subject of the documentary, but this film just sort of really opened my eyes to how absolutely incredible the woman is. And the subject of The Barefoot Artist is Lilia, who is just this incredible, colorful, phenomenal activist artist who has made such an incredible impact on the world in general, not just the art world, but just the world. It was born in Taiwan, grew up there, and then in 1963 she moved here to the States in order to attend the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of the Fine Arts. She became a professor of painting and of art history at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and then, not that that's not impressive enough as it is, but in the 1980s, she became the co-founder and executive director of the Village of Arts and Humanities in North Philly. Now, the Village of Arts and Humanities is one of those creative places and community spaces that's designed for everyone. It's a sculpture garden for anyone who wants to come to it. There's no question of high versus low art, and that's absolutely in keeping with Ye's whole outlook on the world. No question of high versus low. Art belongs to everyone. Art is vital and transformative and necessary, no matter socioeconomic status, no matter color, creed, whatever. It's for everyone. And while it sounds ridiculous that that has to be said, there's certainly pockets of people within the art world who definitely feel somewhat differently about high versus low and value and things like that. So created this incredible urban sculpture garden space for all, and that space has actually become kind of a model for similar types of spaces throughout the world. And now what is doing, besides, having to work incredibly hard to keep this place funded, and she actually talks about that, how, of course, she's very altruistic and believes in the importance of a space like this, but she also does talk about the difficulties of keeping it running. And I thought that was interesting because a lot of documentaries like this don't go into the back end nitty gritty of, having to put aside your art in order to be a public figure who does fundraising, who schmoozes with all of the important people, which you have to do. Again, I think there are some documentaries that sort of glamorize just the front end of projects like this and artists like this, that just sort of show the pretty picture of this person wants to do nice things for the art world and for whomever. And it's not that simple of a process. And I liked that this was not that kind of documentary, that this was like, it's hard because she spends so much time working to keep the thing running in the first place that art becomes like pushed to the side. And it's very real when she talks about that. There's no artifice to it. She's like, this part of the whole process is absolutely not my favorite part of the process. And I think that lends a certain level of legitimacy to this documentary in particular, and documentaries that also do similar things where they do talk about the realities of the day to day. Now, of course, this project with the Village of Arts and Humanities was a massive, massive part of her life. She was working specifically with that all the way up through 2004. And now she's actually bringing that sort of process, that sort of safe space for all, to these various far-flung cities and countries in places that have real issues of war and calamity. And she's bringing this sort of mentality of art in safe space to these victims. And, she's having great success sort of convincing them to use art as a way to channel like the pain and the hurt and the suffering. And it's interesting when we hear the people whose lives she's touched through these sorts of projects talk about how it's been a massively transformative thing for them, and how it's that trickle down effect, like water rippling. So yeah, brings the concept of making murals, building sculptures, creating these safety spaces. People follow her advice. They take on the responsibility of creating art, and then the next person sees that person's art and starts creating themselves, and so on and so forth. And watching people's response to her, and watching people's response to the art that these other people have created, is really incredible. And it's not just inspiring, it's sort of, I don't know, it really does sort of change the way that you think about just how important art is. With a documentary like this, you end up thinking even more after you finish watching the credits. You continue to sort of process all the things that you witness, and you continue to think about, yeah, for far longer than the hour and a half that the film's runtime goes. So if you are looking for a documentary about a person who is incredibly inspiring, driven, but also still at heart an artist, if you are looking for a documentary about places that are dealing with great tragedy and difficulty, and you are curious about how people are managing that kind of an existence, if you are curious about, the front and back end of public spaces like Village of Arts and Humanities and things like it, check out The Barefoot Artist. It really is an incredibly fascinating, well-rounded documentary that I think will shed light on certain aspects of, altruistic art spaces and things like that, that a lot of other documentaries just sort of skip. And just the fact that Lily Ye is a really interesting human being and such an inspiration, I think that makes this totally worthwhile to check out. So again, available on both Hoopla and on Canopy, The Barefoot Artist. Check it out. Okay, my next recommendation is also available on both Hoopla and Canopy, and that is for 2018's Kusama Infinity. I love this documentary. I also absolutely adore the artist about whom this documentary has been created. Yayoi Kusama has been one of my favorites for years and years and years, and I can't imagine anyone putting together a better chronicle of her life than the team that put this particular film together. I mean, if you are looking for an underdog story, regardless of your interest in art, you have to check out Kusama Infinity. So Yayoi Kusama is, at least as of the late 2010s, considered one of the top selling female artists in the entire world. That is not how she started. I don't think that she at any point in her life ever imagined that being a possibility, but here we are. So she is one of those artists that even if you don't like her work, because it is quite polarizing, I will absolutely concede that. Um, Even if you don't like her work, if you have familiarity with art today, she's a name you're probably at least a little tiny bit familiar with, or at least some of her motives will be visually familiar to you. Anyway, Kusama did not start out as an incredibly successful artist. She struggled for decades. Um, she grew up in Japan during World War II. She had an incredibly challenging family life. Um, like there's so many traumas that she endured as far as her family life goes. Her mother was not at all supportive of her art. She thought it was absolutely a waste of time, and Yayoi actually had to sort of bargain in order to take art classes. She promised to take, etiquette classes that would teach her how to be a proper Japanese lady, in order to go to art classes. By the by, she would definitely sort of blow off the etiquette classes in order to go to art class. Not such a great idea, but she did that, because those were the things that mattered to her. And we hear insights about how things that happened in her childhood very specifically affected how she creates art even today. She's known for sort of this frenetic, speedy way of putting things together at times. And that actually stems, and this is absolutely fascinating, from when she was a child. And she would be drawing, and then her mother would sort of sneak up on her and rip the paper away to stop the art. Not that she was supposed to be doing something else, though. I mean, when you're a child, I'm sure there are always things that your parents want you to do. But because of that sort of sense of looming gloom and doom to whatever she's putting together, she sort of incorporated that into her work process. Like, she has to finish quickly, she has to get these things done, and that sort of frenzy comes across when you see some of her pieces, and it absolutely comes across. And those are just teeny tiny tidbits that we learn along the way. One of that particular story is told by one of the many, many curators that she's worked with over her lifetime. But what I loved about this documentary is that there are huge swaths where we're just talking to Kusama, where we're hearing, these really deep confessional thoughts and feelings. And it really does lend a different kind of insight to someone's work when you hear how they feel about it. It's always going to be a challenge to gain truth from an individual artist's work, but I think regardless of what's going on outside, when we hear from Kusama about how she was affected with a certain project, we really do get to see what was going on in her mind at the time. Again, of course, there's always going to be outside forces at work, but I think that first person insight is something that you can't really do without when you're working on a documentary like this. It goes through a lot of very real traumas that she had to deal with, as I mentioned, as a child, but then as she really started to try and make inroads in the art world. The art world back then, today, probably in the future, is definitely a Western-centric, male-dominated field. It is not easy to, even today, be female and a person of color and break into that particular sphere, let alone when she was trying to do this. She was Japanese, she was female, she was living in a post-World War II realm where, of course, a lot of doors were going to be slammed in her face to begin with. And she always had this very different sort of viewpoint. Now we see it as revolutionary and as, outside the box, but at the time it was just too discordant with what was coming out. So she had a lot of difficulty getting noticed, getting established, but she did just by sheer brilliance, but also by, her willingness to just continue on, and her need to just continue creating. You know, she came up in the time of artists like Andy Warhol, and excuse me, she was part of a really evolving art realm to begin with. And her pieces, in a world of pieces that pushed buttons even further. um, she definitely was someone who was not afraid to put together controversial pieces, and I absolutely love that about her, and I think that comes across really, really well when you hear what she has to say. um, she was doing different kinds of installation art. She was actually really revolutionary in some styles of installation art. um, in particular, there's one piece that she had done about a boat that had protrusions all over it. Um, she photographed this piece and then proceeded to plaster the entire gallery with these images. So it's a boat floating in a sea of other boats like it. And at the time, nothing like that was being done. It was considered, something entirely new, something creative, explosive. And what happens to this small time artist who, while she was gaining some attention, was certainly not at the levels of some of the highest people who she was friends with at that particular time. But then, point of fact, Andy Warhol who she was friendly with, came to her exhibit and thought this is really, really cool and talked to her about it, and then did the exact same thing. Warhol was, of course, a darling of the art world. People loved him. The press absolutely adored him. And so he took this idea that she had successfully created, that he admired, and did the exact same thing. I mean, the whole process of plastering the room with repeated imagery that he had created in order to make this echoing sense. Um, and that happened to her multiple times. Things like that continued. Artists who worked in one medium would see her new work in, say, like soft sculpture. And then all of a sudden, these artists that were working in a different medium switched to soft sculpture, these more established artists. And, you don't have a trademark on a particular style, but it is really interesting that these much more established, critically acclaimed people who were friends with her would see what she was working on shift because, ooh, good idea. And then suddenly they're the ones who are considered the innovators. This happened to her multiple times. This also definitely sort of pushed her in a way that caused great mental anguish and distress. And, she would actually use her art to combat that. She was one of those people who was a firm believer in art therapy at a time when it wasn't a big movement. And, she would create even more. She would create through the dark periods of her life and shift it to, find herself pockets of people who were like-minded, who liked what she was creating, who saw her as an originator, who didn't care that she wasn't already getting big press. And that sort of smaller crowd built. It grew and it grew and it grew. And not suddenly, over time, she developed a massive, massive following, which is what she has today. This documentary talks about how, of course she had difficulties in the Western art world, but she had difficulties in the Eastern art world too. She wasn't even acknowledged by, say, like her hometown as a global artist until the 90s, which is absolutely insane. So, it's one of those films that gives this incredibly full picture of who she was, of her importance. If you aren't familiar with her, I strongly suggest checking this one out because she is such an interesting human being. I mean, the things that she's overcome, the way she channels it into the types of art that she channels, and it's definitely coded by those traumas. There's no doubt that that's true. But it's just one of those documentaries that grabs onto you from the get-go and doesn't let you go. It's just too interesting. Like, you don't get bored at any point. And no matter who we're hearing from, whether it is Kusama herself or many of the other art experts, her friends, there's always a story that grabs you. And I just love both her and this particular film, uh, for sort of giving us that full picture of who she is. So if you are interested in an underdog story, again, regardless of your feelings about art, if you love art and are interested in people who do innovative, really self-focused work, if you like artists who do that sort of pop style but who are always looking for something new to challenge themselves with, check out Kusama Infinity. It is a phenomenally well done documentary about an incredible artist. It's my pick of the week. I absolutely love it, and I hope that you'll check it out. Okay, my final recommendation for this week is available on Canopy, and that is 2019's Nice Chinese Girls Don't. This is such a great documentary. It's super short. It's just a teeny tiny bit over 20 minutes, and it is absolutely worth the watch. Nice Chinese Girls Don't follows Kitty Sway as she chronicles her life as an activist poet, a writer, a bodybuilder. And let me tell you, I would watch an entire documentary just about her journey as a small-time bodybuilder, because that part was absolutely fascinating. It talks about the early days of the women's liberation movement in San Francisco, of which she was a big part. And it talks about her experience as an other throughout all of that. We get little glimpses of her early life. She was originally raised by her grandmother, with whom she had this phenomenal relationship. They were really close. She was totally spoiled. She talks about that. And then the shift of when she lived with her grandmother, to when she was moved back with her mother and father, and how that changed a lot of things for her. She ended up moving with them to the States in San Francisco, which at the time was the largest population of Chinese people outside of China, and how her parents' conservative background definitely caged her in a lot, and how it informed so much of how she was feeling about herself, and like inadequacies that she was feeling about herself. They had very specific ideas of what it meant to be a Chinese woman, about what it meant to be a Chinese woman living in America, and it just did not jive with who she was. So she talks about leaving the nest very early on and never living with her parents again. And it talks about how she ends up becoming this huge force of nature, especially within the LGBTQ Asian American movement. At the time when she was coming out in the 70s, the women's lib movement was really a big deal in San Francisco, but it was primarily being led by Caucasian women, which is not surprising in any way, shape, or form. But a person of color's experience is certainly going to be different in a lot of ways. So Sway found herself building and gravitating towards a lot of other Asian American women who were living similar experiences that she as she was. And she and those women really created this forward momentum for LGBTQ, specifically lesbian, Asian Americans, that was not in existence prior to. Like, there was not an organized group. And the fact that she was so forward with that, and then her poetry was really colored by all of her experiences through that, and she talks about it in such a passionate way. Throughout this entire documentary, she's speaking in verse format, and it gives a rhythm to her story that I think really informs the watcher as to how she felt about things that were happening to her, how she felt about how the world was responding to her. Again, there's this little patch of information about her experiences as a bodybuilder and how it showed her elements of herself that she'd not realized were there. And I mean, it seems like this quirky little anecdote at first, but then you realize it actually ties into so many things that were repressed about her, and finally letting those pieces um, be sort of wild and crazy and expressive in public. It was probably one of my favorite little bits throughout this incredibly short 20 minutes. Um, we learn about, you know, how she shifted viewpoints on certain things, and she talks about different periods of her life and how they relate to anyone. And the documentary ends with her talking about aging with grace. And it's such, I think we all at some point in our lives think about what the end is going to look like for us. And she's very honest about what she feels her end is going to look like and how other people have talked to her about that. Like, she talks about a conversation she has with her grandmother where she comes out to her, and, you know, the only thing that her grandmother says is, "But what happens in the end?" And I think that is one of those moments when you just sort of feel something seize up in your chest when she talks about it, because there's no malice in the statement. It's not, you know, an expected, oh, she doesn't want her to come out to her or anything, but it's a genuine concern of, so where do you see this ending? And it just, it's really one of those moments that makes you absolutely think, to stop and think and see how Sway deals with that little moment as well. So if you are interested in a documentary about a fascinating person, if you are interested in othered populations in, say, a woman's lib movement, if you are interested in American history, in art history, if you are interested in just a really entertaining as well as an informative 20-minute documentary, please, please, please check out Nice Chinese Girls Don't. It is exceptionally fun to watch in a lot of ways that I was not expecting. And I think you'll like it too. So again, available on Canopy, Nice Chinese Girls Don't. Make sure you check it out. Okay, that's it for this week's Film Rec Friday. If you have any recommendations for documentaries or movies about Asian American and Asian fine artists, please, please, please comment with those below. I've loved all of the ones that I've watched so far, including the ones that didn't make the cut. So I'm always looking for other titles to check out. If you have any recommendations for themes that you'd like us to cover in the future, please comment with those too. I'm definitely always looking for those kinds of recommendations. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out this week's show. Thank you so, so much for joining me. I absolutely adore putting these lists together, and it gives me a chance to really explore all that our video services offer, and they offer a lot. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Thanks so much again for joining me. See you next week. Bye-bye.